The Custodes are the best of the best, but who are the best of the best of the best? Today we're comparing the strength of the units for the Golden Boys. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video, we're returning for a focus on the Adeptus Custodes, certainly one of the stronger factions of 9th edition, often seen resolutely walking forwards onto objectives and then refusing to die once there. In this video, we're going to go through each and every Custodes unit, both within their codex for Games Workshop and all of their many Forge World options as well. I've decided to rank the units into 3 tiers, starting with Tier 3 the weakest, and moving forward to Tier 1 the strongest. We'll cover each unit, roughly how I feel it fits in the Custodes army, and why I've chosen to rank it where it is. The Sisters of Silence are now kind of technically part of the Custodes army. I have talked about them as well, but I thought we'd keep them just a little bit separate, so they'll be talked about at the end. As always with these tier lists, they are at least somewhat dependent on personal opinion and experience. If you think that I've rated anything too high or too low, please let me know and why down in the comments. In any case, let's jump straight into it, and we'll start with some of the Custodes units that might be struggling a bit more down in Tier 3. So here we have the units that I've currently ranked weakest for the Adeptus Custodes. We have the Venerable Landvader, Valerian and Alea, the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnought, the Coronis Grav Carrier, Agamatus Custodians, and the Orion Assault Dropship. First up, the Venerable Landvader might be a little bit better point for point compared with other Landvaders. It hits on 2s and has a 6+ feel no pain, but I still think that it suffers from the exact same issues. The main ones being that it's just not all that efficient as a massive gun platform, and if you do try and make use of its transport capacity, then you have a very high chance of it getting locked up in combat. If you trundle your Custodes towards the centre of the board in this thing, then it could just get tagged by light infantry, then you're forced to either fall back and fire nothing, or fire all of those expensive las cannons into a light infantry squad and basically waste its firepower anyway. It also just perhaps doesn't make all that much good use of Custodes synergies and options, and weirdly compared with the infantry isn't even all that tough. Almost everything in the list gets a 2+ save anyway, and for the points it isn't actually all that hard to shift the Landvader with some hefty anti-tank fire. Next we have Valerian and Alea, 200 points for a Custodes Shield Captain level character and Alea a Sister of Silence character. I think my main problem with this pair is that Valerian just doesn't compare all that well to standard Shield Captains. You can't get Warlord traits, relics, or the Captain Commander abilities, and it just suffers from inflexibility. I think that Alea is pretty good in her own right, to be honest. It's quite nice to have that psychic denial on a character with character protection, but seeing as you're forced to take them as a pair, I just don't really think that it adds up to all that much. Aside from that shielded psychic denial, the pair just don't really bring all that much that you can't get elsewhere in the Custodes army. Next up we have the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnought, which I might have been tempted to put in Tier 2. My main issue with this thing isn't really that it's all that bad in its own right, it just feels so vastly outshadowed by the Forge World Contemptor Dreadnoughts. It is a fairly solid all-rounder, maybe bearing a multi-melter, reasonably durable with a 2+ armor save and 5+ invul, and has a little bit of accurate 2+ shooting and fighting. My issue is that the Forge World ones just seem flat better than this, so I think it's rarely going to get taken in a competitive list. I do feel that the Forge World ones look infinitely nicer than this model as well. Next we have the Coronis Grav Carrier, a 250 point transport unit that just seems really quite expensive for what you get to me. You can carry a fairly hefty amount of Custodes in this thing, and it does move quite fast, but for what you get it's not really all that tough. Its firepower for the points is weaker than the Caladius, and again it has a similar problem to the Landvader in that you're paying for a lot of guns that could easily get shot down by getting locked up. Typically in 40k you're usually going to want transports to cost a bit less than the units they're transporting, and even with expensive Custodes infantry, this thing's really going to struggle with that. For me, I'd just rather invest in more elite bodies, except that they might move a little bit slower towards the enemy, but I just don't think that this is worth it for the points that you invest. Next we have the Forge World Jetbikes, the Agamatus Custodians. They're basically very similar in stat line and abilities to the Virtus Praetors, with some interesting and different shooting attacks. The thing is that I think that they were really quite balanced against the Virtus Praetors when they cost the same amount of points, but the Virtus Praetors received a 10 points reduction in the January update, and these guys did not. Despite having their own interesting options, I just feel that these guys are now just Virtus Praetors -1. For the extra investment, I just don't think that you really get anything massive on top of them. If they cost the same, then they'd be a really interesting option, but as they don't, I would not take them. Finally, we come to the Orion Dropship. This guy's an enormous 500 point flyer, which kind of means it has to do a very hefty amount in the list just to justify its existence. The Orion's main problem is perhaps just that it's a lot costlier than the Ares gunship, and also has lower firepower as well and no bomb attack. Again, I'm not massively convinced that the transport capacity is a load of use. It could help you deliver one squad into the enemy fairly reliably, I guess, but if you are loading this up with Custodes, then you're putting an enormous amount of eggs in one basket. Generally, I just think that the Ares would be a better points investment than this guy. He's at risk of being ignored with not enough firepower for the 500 points, and he's not going to do much for objectives as he is a flyer. Moving onwards and upwards, here we have Tier 2. The units that I think are all solid units for the Custodes battle line, but maybe just not quite as stand out as the ones in Tier 1. Nothing wrong with including any of these, but they just lack the certain flair that some of the higher units have. Here I've chosen to rank the Caladius Grav Tank, the Custodian Wardens, the Pallas Grav Attack, the Ares Gunship, and the Custodians with Adricite or Pyrothite Spears. I think the Caladius is an interesting choice, and perhaps out of these might be one of the units that I'd be most tempted to rank higher. It's a tank for just over 200 points, that's a reasonable gun platform with ballistic skill 2+, good movement, and a 5+ invul save. I don't really have any real problem with the Caladius, it's fine for what it does, it just doesn't seem enormously stand out for the points either. I feel that you just get a solid amount of shooting, movement, and defense for the points that you put in, but it doesn't really do anything special or above that. A solid battle line unit, perfectly usable for the Custodes army. Next up we have the Custodian Wardens, the Elite's Choice Custodians that can take either spears or axes, and they get a feel no pain type save and an extra attack. I think those buffs do make them fairly balanced against standard Custodian Guard with spears. You pay a little bit more points, but you do get a little bit more survivability and melee damage for the investment. I think the Warden's biggest weakness though is that they can't take storm shields like the standard Custodian Guard, and they also don't have the troops battlefield role, which you kind of need to fill out either battalion or patrol detachments. I think that the option of storm shields just take the standard guard to the next level, and means that people often tend to overlook Wardens when building competitive lists. Next we have the Pallas Grav Attack, which I kind of have similar feelings to the Caladius about. A fast moving and accurate gun platform, maybe a bit fragile for the points, but you pretty much get a fair gun line unit for what you invested. Can fill a useful role in the Custodes army, having a few small harassment units to hunt down small units, or go in jumping table quarters, or reach far-flung objectives. But it just doesn't really feel like a very mandatory include to the army. You probably won't hurt yourself by taking any of these, but they're not really going to be forming your core strategy. Next up we have the other really big hitter flyer in the Ares Gunship. Again, this is a big case of putting eggs in one basket. It's 450 points, really quite resilient, but compared with the Orion it has some fairly intense weaponry that's going to be pretty strong against vehicles, and it can also generate a fair amount of damage with its bombing run. Again, a bit of a hefty investment in an already very elite army, but I think at least this one, when compared with the Orion, won't be as easy to ignore. You're going to be stacking some really hefty damage on one unit every single turn. It still definitely has its downsides, such as not being able to interact with objectives, but some people really do seem to like these things, and they have seen competitive play before. Finally, for Tier 2, we have the Custodians with Adricite or Pyrothite Spears, basically one of the Forge World versions of the standard Custodian Guard. Out of the two, I'm most interested by those Pyrothite Spears, the ones that essentially trade their bolt weapon for a melter shot at close range, so provide an interesting option of some close range melter fire in addition to their already good combat prowess. These guys do have the troop slots, but again for me I just really would struggle to take them over Storm Shield Custodian Guard. It'd be a bit more tempting if you could maybe mix and match the two and have some guys with the melter shots combined with some guys with Storm Shields. Moving on, we come to the top tier of Custodes units. These are the ones that I feel are the very strongest picks, and are perhaps the most commonly picked competitive options in Custodes lists. It's quite a decent selection, it's quite nice to see so many options being viable out of the Custodes range. Here I've chosen to rank Trajan Valoris, Shield Captains, Custodian Guard, Sagittarium Guard, Telamon Dreadnoughts, the Forge World Contemptor Dreadnoughts, the Vexillus, both patterns of Terminators, Virtus Praetors, and the Venatari Custodians. Let's start out with Trajan and the Shield Captains. Mr. Trajan, High Lord of Terror himself, is a great melee beatstick, and also provides the best buffing aura for the Custodes, allowing a reroll 1 to hit and wound when you're within 6 inches of him. He's really good to have at the centre of a battle line no matter what you're bringing. It's pretty survivable, as you'd expect for a Shield Captain, so he's not going anywhere anytime fast, and on top of that you get the Moment Shackle, which has multiple strong uses, whether that's healing him a bit, getting a whole extra fight phase, or stopping you from spending as many command points. He's 190 points, so isn't cheap, but I believe for what you get, he's a pretty decent deal. Next we come to the Shield Captains themselves, coming in 3 flavours: Foot, Terminator, or Dawn Eagle jet bikes. The Foot and Terminator ones are quite similar, you just pay a bit of a premium for the extra wound and the deep strike on the Terminator version. or you pay a significant amount more for the significant advantages of the Dawn Eagle jet bike, massive movement, reasonable shooting, and very solid melee with that interceptor lance. I think that these guys are really effective, and you can get multiple stacking buffs on them that make them some of the most durable and annoying characters in the game. For example, you could take the Dawn Eagle Shield Captain, make him 9 wounds with a Captain Commander trait, give him a 3+ invul with a relic, a 5+ feel no pain with a Warlord trait, and then Victor of the Blood games to allow him to reroll 1 failed save per turn. Congratulations, you've just made one of the hardest characters in the entire game to remove. He's still fast with very good melee, and what's more, he even has objectives secured as well, so when you zip him onto an objective, then it has a good chance of being yours. Multiple strong builds for these guys. I do quite like a lot of the other Captain Commander traits as well. Next up we have the Custodian Guard, and as we've said a couple of times already, I think that they're top tier because of their Storm Shields. Again, Storm Shield plus Custodes armor makes them one of the most durable choices in all of 40k. The Storm Shield special rule still means that they get a 3+ invul save due to the Custodes army-wide special rule for getting boosted invuls. Anything AP-1 will still be saved on a 1+, and anything with massively high AP will be caught on that 3+ invul. They're pretty much an ideal choice to slog towards the centre of the table, be able to tank charges or laugh off massive amounts of damage and still pack a big threat in close combat. While the Custodian Guard are slogging towards the centre of the table, the Sagittarium Guard are the troop's choice that's perhaps the best for holding down home field objectives. These guys still have the decent Custodes defensive profile, a 2+ save, toughness 5 and 3 wounds, but they're great for doing the boring work of holding the home field objectives because each of them blazes away with a heavy bolter style profile hitting on 2s. Even if the enemy does manage to close with them though, they're still a no slouch up close. Give them each a Misericordia and they'll still be hitting with some decent AP at strength 5. And those bolt casters also have a close range ray projector attack, which they can fire at the same time, so their shooting is even nastier up close. It's really common to see a unit or two of these holding down the home field objectives. Next up we come to the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought, and going with a bit of a theme for these tier 1 slots. Again, it's one of the most durable units in 40k, this time being one of the toughest vehicles that you can possibly field. Again, it's a bit of an anvil for the Custodes army, toughness 8, a 2+ armor save, 14 wounds, a 4+ invul, -1 damage, and a 6+ feel no pain. You're going to need more than a little bit of incidental anti-tank fire to rid yourself of this thing. I will say that for the points invested, the damage output isn't spectacular on the Telemon. I think you're more getting the reassurance that it's very likely to be doing that damage output every single turn for the entire game, or you're going to force your opponent to spend absolutely tons of firepower trying to rid themselves of it. In any case though, it'll certainly chip away at enemies with its ranged weapons, and pack some hefty melee threat in close combat with that Telemon Cestus. Next we come to some of my very favourite Custodes units, the Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought and the Contemptor Galatus. I think these guys are both absolutely awesome and really fun dreadnoughts to use. Much like the Telemon, they're very tough for the points, packing a 2+ armor save, good invuls and a 6+ feel no pain. Then you've got the choice of one of either two options. The Achilles will both have decent shooting with that Dread Spear, 2 strength 8 damage 3 ranged attacks, a swathe of Lastrum bolters and massive damage D3+3 in melee. The Galatus trades some of its ranged damage for a 4+ invul and -1 to hit in combat, and again packs a massive amount of generalist melee damage, averaging 7 strength 7 AP -3 and damage 3 attacks, all hitting on 2s. Both of these guys are just really solid for the 180 so points that you'd spend on them, and you really can't go too far wrong with them in a Custodes list. Next up we have the Vexillus Praetor, the Custodes Elite Choice Banner Bearer, and another model that's really easy to get your investment back with, as it has a -1 to hit aura with the Vexilla Magnifica. Provided your opponent's got a decent amount of ranged fire, this will be really good against most people, whether it's just protecting a shield wall advancing, or hanging out with some shooting units, making them just that bit more resilient to enemy fire. The Vexillus doesn't really want to be on the front lines quite as much as the shield captains, so it can be quite a good choice for a safe warlord trait, though it does have the potential to pull off quite a nifty manoeuvre with its deep strike stratagem, when you bring in an enemy unit that's been put in reserve and deploy it right next to them, and for a couple of command points it can deploy right close to the enemy army without having to worry about that 9-inch rule. It's a pretty powerful manoeuvre just to have this Vexillus be able to throw down a scary melee unit right in the middle of the board, and then near guarantee a charge with it because of how close it gets to start to the enemy. I wouldn't say that these guys are mandatory within the Custodes list, though they are quite a powerful tool if you want to choose to include them. Moving on, we come to the Terminators, where I think that both the Alaris Terminators from the Codex and the Aquilon Terminators from the Forge World decks both are fairly equally viable and have their uses. Their damage output and durability is fairly similar to standard Custodian Guard, but they do have the bonus of innate deep strike and both pack a bit of shooting in their own way. The Alaris are a little bit cheaper, can ignore AP-2 with a stratagem, and have that very fun and disruptive Unleash the Lion stratagem, where all the individual Terminators can go their own way and just cause havoc throughout the opponent's army. They can also use their concussion grenades from the grenade launchers as well, which are another very powerful option. The Aquilon Terminators have less tricks and they are a little bit more expensive, but I would say that they're perhaps just a bit more dangerous all round, both at shooting and in melee. Strength 10 and AP-3 just makes them a bit more threatening than the Alaris, and compared with those grenade launchers, I'd much rather have those Lastrum Stormbolters for some solid Strength 5 anti-horde. I'd say basically the choice between them comes to whether you'd like the nifty stratagems, or just trade it out for some better all-round damage dealing. Up next are the jet bikes, and we have the Virtus Praetors from the main codex. These golden bikers spawned entire armies of nothing but when they first dropped, and while they're not quite that bonkers good at the moment, they still add some very fast moving, fairly tough models with decent melee and decent shooting. Those Hurricane Bolters can be a really good choice for adding some solid anti-horde to the Custodes list. Up close, even a unit of 3 will pack 36 strength 4 shots or hitting on 2s, and that's going to take a chunk out of pretty much any infantry that you focus at them on. Their melee is pretty much all round good, with re-rolling wounds with those Interceptor Lances, and they also have the horrifically powerful trick of Stooping Dive. Basically, these can be a good unit to have in the centre of your battle line. Say your opponent tries to charge one of your outlying units, you do have to spend a hefty 3 command points for it, but it basically allows you to countercharge that enemy unit and then strike before them. It means that you could potentially deal hefty damage to an enemy melee threat, potentially kill them before they even get to strike, destroy a unit in their turn, and maybe even save one of your own Custodes ones to be able to fight freely. When Stooping Dive works well, it can certainly be game changing. For all these advantages, I think you do pay a slight premium for them. For the durability, they're just not quite as cost efficient as the standard Custodians, but I'd still see them as a very solid choice, maybe for a unit or two, compared with an entire battle line of them. Last but by no means least are a Forge World Fast Attack Custodes unit, which are the Venatari Custodians. Again, they're really fast moving, relatively tough models that have OBSEC. You have the choice by having really decent melee or really decent defense with Tarsus Bucklers, and it seems that most competitive lists go for the Tarsus Bucklers and Kinetic Destroyers for a fast moving 2+ save Custodes model with some really good close range shooting. Those Kinetic Destroyers are Strength 6, AP-2 and Damage 2, so are pretty vicious against whatever they shoot at. It's really nice to have fast moving OBSEC that can steal enemies' objectives away. Their main downside being that their melee is just a bit weaker than standard Custodes. With Damage 1 they're only going to be good against infantry, but they'll still scrape a few wounds off whatever they get in melee with. Again, seems like a solid fast unit to have bounding up the field, maybe good for purging some enemies off home field objectives. Finally, I just thought we'd go over the Sisters of Silence, seeing as they can be fielded within the same Custodes detachments, and here's how I'd rank the Sisters of Silence units. In Tier 3 I'd put the Witch Seekers, in Tier 2 I'd put the Vigilators and the Normaiden Rhino, and in Tier 1 I'd put the Prosecutors. The Witch Seekers I just don't really see as being very good. They're the Flamer-armed variant, they cost a whopping 18 points per model for really quite a fragile stat line, and their damage output is unfortunately quite weak and also quite close range. It's really not a good combination all round. I'd say the biggest advantage for these girls is that they have some really cool looking flamers. I chose to rank the Vigilators in turn 2. They're the ones with the Great Blades, they're 17 points per model, and they can stack a fair amount of Strength 5 High AP Damage 2 melee, which is going to be pretty lethal to whatever they manage to catch in combat. They have a stratagem to allow them to get +1 to wound, which in a similar way to Sisters Repentia from the Sisters of Battle might allow them to punch above their weight. I would say that they're a bit fragile for their points cost, and they could do with their transport, and I'd say the main reason that I wouldn't rank them higher is just that Strength 5 melee really isn't something that the Custodes army is really struggling for. You've got so many troops and Terminators that just provide oodles of that already, and I'm not sure there's much value to having more of it on a really fragile platform when you can already get a lot of it on really tough ones. I also chose to rank the Normaiden Rhino here. It's basically the same as any other Rhino, a nice cheap transport tank, and I'd say it's a solid pick if you're thinking about using Vigilators to try and get them up close. It does come with a bit of a downside for the Sisters of Silence though, as that while the Sisters are embarked in the Rhino, it means they won't be able to use their signature abilities, making everything harder to cast psychic powers. For that reason, I'd say it's only so good. I guess kind of handy to have around once you're done with the transport capacity, can be good for holding up enemy units or screening or nuisance charging, but maybe not quite as mandatory in some other armies. Finally, my favourite unit for the Sisters of Silence are the Prosecutors, which I'd say do the Sisters of Silence job best out of them, mainly because they're so much cheaper at 13 points per model, and in the Custodes army that really does have value. They're the cheapest infantry unit that Custodes can field, which means that they can be a good cheap chaff unit, good for screening, holding down objectives, and doing things like actions or grunt work. There's a lot of jobs that you don't really want to be fielding an entire 150 point Custodes unit to do, and these guys can fill that gap. On top of that, if you are just taking Sisters of Silence for the psychic defense, then this is how you can get that psychic defense for the cheapest amount of points possible. They do have less damage dealing than the Vigilators and the Witch Seekers, but honestly I think I'd rather not pay for more damage dealing and have the nice cheap bodies so they can focus on the job that they're actually meant to do, rather than trying to get themselves killed at close range proximity to the enemy. So anyway, I think that just about rounds up our summary of the Adeptus Custodes in 9th. Really quite a cool army with tons of strong options. It's good to see quite so many seeing play in competitive lists. Let me know what you think of the rankings, and if you think I've ranked anything too high or too low down in the video comments. I'm certainly interested to learn anything I can from more experienced Custodes players. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly be trying to keep all the 40k content coming. I'm sure we'll get round to a fair few more Custodes videos in the future. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that there's a Patreon page down in the video description, so feel free to check that out if you'd like to help keep all this content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few rewards, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.